A little disclaimer before I begin. This is an assignment for my speech class. We were told to pick a topic for a persuasive speech, and then we were told we had to argue the opposite side of what we had planned on arguing. So not all of the following statements support my beliefs about this topic. When I say the words gender pay gap, a fourth of my audience probably rolls their eyes and thinks, here we go again. Another fourth gets super defensive, and the other half is pretty indifferent towards the whole thing. However, the gender pay gap between men and women is much more complicated than you might think. According to an article by Time newsletter on the gender wage gap, if you control for things like college majors and occupations, the pay gap, or the discrepancy between men and women's earnings that can be attributed to bias and discrimination, shrinks to about 1/3 of its size. Today, I will be discussing how data has been skewed in favor of a larger pay gap, while also persuading you that this topic isn't as black and white as one might assume, along with what the opposition may have to say about this matter. While it may seem like there's a large wage gap standing in the way of equality in the workplace, in all actuality, at least in the realm of lower-level employees, the pay gap is fairly non-existent. At this level, most workers are treated equally, and they get raises based on the quality of their work, rather than a bias towards one gender or another. However, the higher you climb on a company totem pole, the more problems you have with the gender pay gap. In a joint 2019 report by Business Wire and Korn Ferry, it was shown that in the US, the gap in wages between top and lower level employees widened to about 12% over the course of 10 years. Higher level employees are paid significantly more than lower level employees, and this makes sense. But the gap between the higher and lower employees brings about a more drastic assumption of the gender pay gap. Comparing male CEOs and business leaders to women in the working class just isn't reasonable. And if this is the data used, it's no wonder the pay gap seems so wide. More recently, we've strayed into the like versus like territory, comparing those working similar jobs with similar experiences, rather than the working class versus the elite few. If we take a look at the actual numbers, the data can be easily misinterpreted in favor of a larger wage gap between men and women. In a 2020 research project by PayScale, it was shown that uncontrolled data makes the gap seem much worse than it is. With this in mind, the average woman makes 81 cents to an average man's dollar. However, this doesn't account for any experience in the work field, time spent in a field or with a company, the industry a person is in, the location of the company, along with several other factors. Taking these all into account, a woman makes 98 cents to a man's dollar. So there's still a gender pay gap, but it is significantly smaller than without these controlled factors. If we also take into account occupation and college education, women generally go into lower paying fields for a variety of reasons. More women tend to take classes in arts and humanities. Some women choose to be stay-at-home moms, and all of their labor is unpaid. More women go into early education or take up nursing jobs and other vital careers. But a nurse doesn't make as much as a doctor. That's just a fact of our society. There is a very real reason for this separation. There's heavy bias against women in the STEM fields. In fact, lots of countries actively dissuade women from pursuing these paths. While the US is getting better about this, there's still so much sexism in the STEM fields, which in itself is a deterrent for women. Of course, STEM fields are the ones in high demand and are paid far more than any other job, especially with COVID still rampant in the US today. So the next step in addressing the gender pay gap problem is understanding that, at least in the US, this isn't as big of an issue as other more pressing topics regarding women's rights. Now, my argument has specifically been about the gender pay gap. However, the other side may argue that race, ethnicity, sexuality, and other big factors are influencers of the pay gap. White women are paid far better than Native American or Hispanic women, and they might argue that you can't just separate gender and race. Both are defining factors in women, in all people, and taking one away turns this real and serious problem into statistics on a page. When hashed out like this, The pay gap is attributed to one thing: your core values. In a 2018 study by the Foundation for Economic Education, the author proposed that it turns out different people value different things, and when you control for those differences, there's not much difference between what men and women make. Obviously, this is a very general statement and has to be taken with a grain of salt. However, it holds value in the fact that men and women do prioritize differently, and this may have an effect on their wages. Today, I've talked about how the pay gap isn't as prevalent in lower-level employees, as well as how the data of the gender pay gap can be easily misinterpreted based on certain control factors. So next time you decide to debate on the gender pay gap, do your research. After all, this problem isn't as clear-cut as one might assume.